河南到底死了多少人？
政府统计1062人，
实际呢？
大约300万人。
From the winter of 1942 to the spring of 1944, due to a severe drought, Henan province plunged into a once-in-a-century famine. Fan, a local landlord in Yenzhou, was a wealthy landowner, and despite his vast holdings, he couldn't avoid the envy directed at his grain stores. After a night when the entire village rose up in looting, Fan's son tragically lost his life. Consequently, Fan had no choice but to join the flood of refugees leaving Henan, taking his family, servants, and their remaining provisions with them. During their journey, in a landscape where most people couldn't even fill a bowl with millet, desperation led to extreme actions. Even those who were typically known for their kindness turned cunning. Mr. Ma, a former chef who used to cook for government officials, was now in a position to forcibly conscript Fan's servants into the military and confiscate their guns. To secure their release, Mr. Ma demanded a steep price equivalent to 3 liters of white flour. Fan had no choice but to comply with Mr. Ma's demands. Later, a fellow villager of Fan's named Xiaolu, driven by hunger and the lack of food, began secretive transactions at night, exchanging his own child for sustenance. Witnessing this heart-wrenching scene, Xiaolu's wife went mad and snatched their child away. Touched by this poignant moment, Fan decided to give some rice to Xiaolu. However, surrounded by pleading eyes, Fan could only spare a small portion. While the common people were starving, government officials had a very different experience at their dinner tables. Among them was the newly appointed chairman of Henan province, Refugee, who received flattery from 3 officials, all hoping to secure a larger food allocation for their respective counties. However, Chairman Li's purpose in this famine-stricken land was to collect additional military provisions, a task he found excessively oppressive. Chairman Li promptly met with General Jiang Dingwen of the First War Zone and requested a reduction in the demand to deliver 30 million shengs of military provisions, a directive handed down from higher authorities.
如果2个人要同时饿死的话，饿死一个灾民，地方还是中国。如果当兵的都饿死了，我们就会亡国。
In light of this situation, Chairman Refugee decided not to press the matter further. He resolved to arrange another meeting with President Chang later. Inside President Chang's office in Chongqing, Chairman Refugee listened attentively as officials reported on the frontline military situation and international affairs. Each issue seemed more pressing than the one he had brought up regarding the famine in Henan. Chairman Refugee realized that discussing the famine was likely not going to happen, so he would have to shoulder the burden himself. However, before departing, Chairman Refugee handed over the report on the famine to President Chang's secretary, with the promise that it would be brought to President Chang's attention at an opportune time. There was still some hope for relief efforts. At the same time, an American journalist named Whitehead was deeply concerned about the drought situation in Henan. However, the answers he received from official sources suggested that cases of starvation were not common, and the primary cause was not natural disasters but rather human actions. Whitehead disagreed with this explanation and felt that high-ranking officials did not seem to take the situation seriously. Consequently, he decided to travel to Henan himself. While the conflict in Henan was intensifying, due to the urgency of various situations, coupled with the severity of the famine, President Chang decided to temporarily withdraw troops from the area. Soon, within the refugee column, the presence of soldiers became noticeable. Those who were unaware believed that they had achieved a victory in battle, and a faint sense of joy welled up within them. Little did they know that the arrival of the military had attracted Japanese bombers. These bombers targeted areas where there were a higher number of soldiers, but unfortunately, innocent refugees were also caught in the crossfire. Amidst a scene of devastation, with shattered buildings and mutilated bodies, the behavior of the attacked soldiers was even more devoid of humanity. They turned their weapons on helpless civilians, forcefully taking their possessions and seizing women, carts, and horses for their own escape. The invaders callously unleashed their bombs, and amidst this chaos, people turned on one another, resulting in mutual violence and brutality. When the smoke finally dissipated, all that remained were the vulnerable, who were unable to protect their families and possessions. Even Fan, once a wealthy landlord, had now become impoverished. American journalist Whitehead, aided by a local priest in Henan, managed to catch up with the refugee column, accompanied by a donkey. What surprised Whitehead was that the rumors he had initially dismissed as hearsay, regarding people resorting to cannibalism, turned out to be true. And he saw with his own eyes wild dogs feasting on human remains. On that fateful night, Whitehead camped near the refugee camp. It so happened that Fan, Xiaolu, and their servant, Xuanzhu, noticed his food supplies and the donkey. Tempted by their desperate circumstances, they decided to steal from Whitehead. Although they inadvertently woke him in the process, they managed to seize the donkey. Unfortunately, the donkey proved too swift, and their prize was lost. Later, while Xielu was searching for the donkey, he finally found it. However, the unfortunate creature had been turned into food by a group of unruly soldiers. In an attempt to steal some meat, Xielu was brutally beaten to death and thrown into a cooking pot. The soldiers, unfazed by the gruesome act, simply remarked, "Why did you put him in the pot?" As people continued rehearsing for a welcoming ceremony for the American ambassador's visit, journalist Whitehead returned to Chongqing in a disheveled state. He was eager to convey his eyewitness account of the dire situation in Henan to the Chinese government. However, the process was fraught with challenges, and it was only with the intervention of Madame Song Qingling that he finally secured an audience with Chairman Chang. While Chairman Chang initially dismissed Whitehead's descriptions of the severe famine in Henan with a chuckle, asserting that such events were impossible in China, it was at that moment that Whitehead unexpectedly switched to speaking in Chinese. He subsequently handed over the photos. After Whitehead's departure, President Chang was furious in his office. He understood the potential consequences of leaking the photos, but in the end, President Chang decided not to suppress the domestic publication of Time magazine. Simultaneously, he ordered Yan Xishan to temporarily halt the Shaanxi campaign and allocate a portion of military provisions to the Henan disaster area. If they didn't take these steps, how would the world perceive them? In the municipal government hall of Henan, Chairman Li was in discussions with various departments regarding the distribution of relief grain. So far, the central government had allocated 80 million catties of grain to them, and everyone was arguing fiercely over how to secure a larger share of it. However, at this moment, a telegram arrived from General Chang. It stated that the Henan government had owed them 30 million catties of military provisions, and now that they had grain, General Chang had apprehended a group of Henan officials. He demanded that Chairman Li use grain to ransom them. Forced into a difficult situation, Chairman Li ultimately gave 3.5 million catties of grain in exchange for gold, which he then presented to General Chang, who didn't have to worry about his own sustenance. With this, the matter was resolved. From this point on, the government finally began large-scale relief efforts, but certain officials began to scheme for their own gain. Relief supplies that were meant to be distributed free of charge became commodities sold at a low price by a certain military officer. Nearby, a businessman who was colluding with the military officer whispered that 1 acre of land was now worth 5 shillings of millet, and after the disaster, if you sold the land, you'd be living in luxury and wealth. Perhaps it was events like this that occurred frequently later on. When a high-ranking official voluntarily donated half of his family's assets for the war effort and disaster relief, he expressed concerns about corruption in the distribution of supplies. President Chang promptly promised to establish a supervisory body, investigate corrupt officials, and punish the guilty. As for Fan, his youngest daughter had brought along a cat when she fled, and she had been caring for it until now. However, with Fan's daughter-in-law expecting a child, the youngest daughter had to reluctantly offer the cat to her sister-in-law for soup. After a long wait, Fan and his family didn't receive any relief resources. Instead, they encountered a truck looking for prostitutes. Faced with their desperate situation, Fan's youngest daughter decided to sell herself to get a few shillings of rice for her family. On New Year's Eve, the Fan family not only failed to reunite but also lost their daughter. Later, Fan's servant, Xuanju, decided to be with Xielu's widow, providing mutual support since they had both lost their spouses. However, shortly after their marriage and amidst the struggle for food, Xuanju's wife intended to sell herself so that her new husband and child could survive. From then on, only Fan, his grandson, and Xuanju and Xielu's 2 children remained in the refugee column. At this moment, they noticed a refugee train bound for Shaanxi, but there were rules for boarding. Passengers had to discard all their food and belongings. The grain they had was what their own family members had sacrificed to obtain, and they couldn't afford to lose it. So, they and other refugees lurked by the train until nightfall, then sneaked aboard. After a rush of people surged onto the train, Fan and his grandson managed to climb onto the front of the train, and Xuanju also made it aboard. However, the next morning, Xuanju realized that he had lost his child. Driven by a sense of responsibility, he quickly jumped off the train and headed back to find his child. But only when he got off the train did he remember that his food was still on board. When he realized this, the train had already departed, leaving him alone in a vast snowy landscape, shouting in desolation. The train finally arrived in Shaanxi, but the local soldiers claimed there were too many refugees and forced the train to turn back, using their guns as threats. So, the refugees began jumping off the train and running into the interior of Shaanxi province to avoid the bullets. Because of the heavy crowds, Fan used his body to protect his grandson. When the gunfire and running had subsided, he finally breathed a sigh of relief, but his grandson had suffocated to death. In April of the same year, during the Henan campaign launched by Japan, with a force of 60,000 soldiers, the Japanese successively occupied 28 cities within Henan province, resulting in a loss of 300,000 nationalist army soldiers. In the outskirts of Luoyang, Mr. Ma had become a local chef for the stationed Japanese troops, and Xuanzhu was also captured by the Japanese there. After the Japanese officers took his child's toys, Xuanzhu resisted and ultimately fell under the Japanese swords. Later in this campaign, the Japanese distributed food to the refugees, and news of the Japanese winning hearts and minds quickly reached Chairman Chang.
河南到底死了多少人？
政府统计1062人，
实际呢？
大约300万人。
On his way back along the road to Shaanxi, Fan, who had no family left, was contemplating that he too should return to his roots when his time came. Along the way, he encountered an orphan girl. Out of kindness, he decided to treat the girl as his own family, and luckily, she ultimately survived. He raised her and she, in turn, had children of her own. After going through the harrowing experiences necessary for survival during that disaster, Fan developed a habit of abstaining from eating meat. Decades later, when the child of that girl suddenly asked about the year 1942, the woman, now a mother herself, did not wish to recall any of the details from that time. It was like a scar, a lasting imprint. No voiceover can replicate the charm of the original film. A great movie deserves to be experienced in its full plot. Thank you for your watching and subscribing.